Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Blue Hornet webinar, Preventing the Oops Email, an Email Marketer's Holiday Success Toolkit. I'm Ashley Deese, and I'm the Digital Marketing Manager at Blue Hornet. I'm also responsible for all of Blue Hornet's emails, so this is something that's near and dear to my heart because being an email marketer, we all know after hitting send, it's kind of scary. So today we're going to be sharing tips as to how to help mitigate some of the risks involved with sending an email, especially around the holiday season when we have tons of emails going out and hurried pace. And again, it's just really scary. So today's presenters are Kara Trivanovich. I got it right that time, right, Kara?
You were pretty close.
Okay. If you have joined a Blue Hornet webinar before, you're very familiar with her. She's our Vice President of Strategic Services. And we also have Peter Taylor, who is the newest member to the Blue Hornet family. Peter brings 25 years of multi-channel business development, marketing, and retail merchandising experience. He was a Director of Business Development and E-commerce at Sports Chalet and also served as General Manager of Roadrunner Sports. So we're very happy to have him here today.
Good morning, everybody.
All right, a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the webinar, just make sure you type them into the box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll be doing a live Q&A with Peter and Kara after the webinar. And if there are any fun tidbits that you want to tweet out during the event, you can use the hashtag #PreventTheOops. So with that, I will turn it over to Kara.
Great. Thank you, Ashley.
Mm-hmm.
As anybody knows who's attended one of our webinars before, too, they all know that you inevitably mess up my name.
Sorry about that.
No worries. All right, so let's get started. Thank you guys all for joining us today and taking some time out of your busy schedules to, have this discussion and conversation. So, as we know, the holidays are a busy time of year for everyone, both professionally and personally, especially if you work in the retail space or you have e-commerce on your site. But, being busy is really no excuse for getting sloppy. I'm not saying that mistakes aren't going to happen, right? Inevitably they are. But before you hit the send button on yet another oops message, let's spend a little bit of time today to look at ways to avoid the oops in the first place. The goal here clearly, and it is with everybody, right? The goal is to not make the mistake to begin with. But, we're going to look at and explore some opportunities and ways that you can avoid the oops. And then, we're going to also look at, how you can mitigate, the impact of the oops. It doesn't always have to be, a code red. So there are ways that we can kind of mitigate the impact. And then, we're going to look at ways that you can kind of get creative with the oops. So we'll have some examples, some oops messages, and I know Peter has some terrific stories that he can share about, about some of the oops moments he's had. So, Peter, I wanted to say thank you for joining me today in this and adding color commentary.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, so let's start at the beginning. What can you actually do to avoid the oops in the first place? So, like I said, we're all human. Mistakes are going to happen. But the best way to avoid largely avoidable mistakes is to have a really tight and succinct process in place for executing your email program. So I know that that's a really easy thing to say, and I'm sure that many of you are probably rolling your eyes at me right now, muttering things like, I don't have time for process, or people throw new things in my lap all the time, and it changes on a minute-by-minute basis. And I would agree. I've been there. I was the person coding the messages and hitting the send button, and I know the angst that goes along with that. And I also know how hurried everything always is. But, there are times when if you just slow down a bit and build a little bit of process into your routine, you might just find that even the slightest step back can drive really great efficiency all the way around. So what types of routines, are we talking about here? It's nothing terribly monumental or time-consuming. After all, it needs to kind of fit into that already crazy routine. So, where I always like to start with this is at the very, very beginning with a project brief. So, the idea of a project brief isn't a new thing, and I know that sometimes saying the word project brief can, bring these visions to your mind of this extremely involved and chaotic, difficult process. Trust me, I have seen my fair share of things called project briefs that were so extremely tedious to execute that I wondered what was brief about them. But it really is, something that is a great format for providing or receiving information, depending on kind of which side of the program execution you're on, that allows this sharing of information so that everybody is level set and on the right page. There are some basic types of information that should be included in every project brief, and clearly this information is going to be known or unknown depending on how involved various people are in the project at various stages, but really it provides a single place where anybody can go that can grasp what you're trying to accomplish with this message. So clearly the important things: who do you want to send it to? Right? Is it going to your full file? Is there a segment definition that needs to happen? Who is it really that is getting the message? You want to know when do you want it to go out? Does it need to go immediately? Is there a specific time or a day in which it's supposed to be deployed? And again, these things sound very basic, but if you have this information consolidated in one place versus in a back and forth series of email communications between two people, the sheer documentation of it actually can provide that pause that everybody needs to take to make sure everything's been thought through. Are there any testing elements? We should always be testing, so there should always be a testing element, which, dovetails right into the next one, at minimum subject lines. So you should always be testing, what is that test? What is the subject line or subject lines you want to leverage? What do you want? What do you want to send them, right? Is it, a newsletter? Is it a promotional offer? What is it that you want to send? And then two really important things that I find sometimes miss the handoff between like a marketing manager and a deployment specialist or a producer is, what's the goal or objective of the campaign? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? What is it that you want the message to accomplish or achieve, and how do you define that success? A lot of times what happens is, we're all moving so quickly, especially during the holiday season, that all we really want to do is get the message out the door, and that's the goal, right? But really, in order to really make sure that who you're sending to, what you're sending, and whether or not it was successful, you need to, really kind of think that through. And the goal of just getting the email out the door isn't really the right goal. So these are, 7 simple questions that can be answered that really do allow everyone involved in the project to be on the same page. And it's really amazing what having kind of a cohesive understanding of the task at hand can do for productivity and quality of the output. The one thing to say, too, is, I understand that every organization has a slightly different nuance or need, so, this is something that you can, clearly adjust to account for, anything that is very specific to, your role, your job, your process. But, the overall goal is just to keep it brief. All right. So one of the 7 questions we referred to is testing elements. And while this doesn't necessarily seem like it's something that can help you minimize oopses or minimize mistakes, it really can. And, test messages do more than just inform program performance. So, there's a few ways that going through a testing process can minimize mistakes or minimize the need for oops. The first is that, any time a test is being implemented, everyone tends to slow down a little bit to make sure that the testing elements are properly defined and that the split is, set up properly in their ESP environment, that, all of the elements that, make up that test have been addressed and have been thought through. So, by nature, the sheer act of slowing down your process can actually prevent the oops. But it can also minimize it as well. So, the other look at this is, if you're doing an A/B test, or if you're doing a test for a small portion of your audience, and then you're going to release the winner to the larger audience. The reality is that that oops will potentially only occur in a small portion of your testing group. So, this means that a smaller portion of your audience may be impacted, and, depending on how the test is conducted, you may actually have the ability to correct it, for the error, or correct that error for the remainder of your subscriber base. So it really can, mitigate, further reach and exposure of a mistake. So it's, not innately, kind of a checkbox thing that says, yeah, I've done this and now I'm going to avoid mistakes, but it can provide you really just the workflow and the mechanism to minimize them some. All right, so finally and most critically and probably most annoyingly obvious is, the need or the idea that you need to have a checklist, right? You need to look at what are the steps you need to go through, what are the check boxes that you can check off to make sure that you have done everything that you needed to do in this process. So I know that, I've worked with a number of organizations, and I've seen, a handful of checklists, and lots of people have them, but you actually need to use them. And the hard part about checklists is that, once you've onboarded a new production person or, the email marketing manager who's deploying the message and they've gone through it a handful of times, they think that I've already done that. I know all of those things. But, the reality is that, something will inevitably go wrong. Right? Something is going to happen, and, making sure that you have actually not just thought through the checklist, but actually physically gone through it and checked the boxes and done the work. You're talking about an extra 5 to 10 minutes before you hit the send button to validate, things like the subject line. So, it's crazy, but, a simple, miskeyed or keystroke error can cause problems. I will never forget, this was many years ago when I was, sending email out, and I made the mistake of copying and pasting the subject line from a Word document. And the ESP that I used is no longer in business, but they had a bug, an unknown bug in their system, that if there was a carriage return in the subject line, it inevitably broke the code that went out the door. And so to, more than 1 million subscribers, I sent myself a test message. Everything looks great. I sent the live message, and over 1 million subscribers got nothing but HTML code in the body of their email, simply because I had a carriage return in the subject line and had no idea it was going to cause a problem. So, making sure that you actually send yourself a live message as part of this testing process is also very critical. You want to make sure that all of the links work, right? This sounds silly, but, you want to make sure you go through, you click the links, and that they're resolving where you think they should resolve. You want to make sure the images are rendering appropriately. And this is, again, something that, you may or may not pick up if you're just simply sending yourself a test message, or if you're only looking at it inside your firewall. Again, once upon a time, I was working with a large airline that, they had a dev environment that they hosted all of their images to, and as long as you were inside their firewall, you could see the images. But once you got outside of their firewall, they weren't there. And so, making sure that you are checking those types of things in the right capacity to validate as much as possible to avoid the need for those oops. And then the other thing, too, is if there's phone numbers in your email, this isn't typically the responsibility of the email person, but as a fail-safe or as an opportunity to make sure you don't have to send out that oops message, call the phone numbers. Call the phone numbers in the message, because there have been times where I have seen numbers that have gotten transposed, and it instead of calling a retirement home, you end up calling an adult hotline, and those are very, very damaging things for a brand, and so making sure that is going to the right place is extremely important, and can help you avoid having to send an oops. And I think that's one important thing to remember is that not every mistake is going to be yours. And so there are times and there are moments when, a mistake happens elsewhere in the organization that affects you. And so those are things we're going to look at them a little bit coming up. But let's avoid the ones we can, right? As email marketers and as the owners of these programs, let's own the avoidable mistakes and let's avoid them.
So, Cara, if I may add, just giving this a bit more context as we approach the holiday season, that all of this activity, this preparation, obviously the timelines get compressed considerably, right, as the holidays come, and the level of activity increases by whatever that factor is depending on your business. And that's a need to actually check even more boxes, including the preparation for your ESP. Your ESP is typically got the same challenges of dealing with a lot more requests to drop a lot more email within the time frame. So micromanaging the drop times, the approximate list size, the delivery periods that are required, and then having some sense of the total cadence of the email strategy through the entire season is something that should be shared both internally but also with your ESP so that they can prep for those drops. And of course notifying you if you're not fully in contact with the web personnel themselves to be aware if your site is hosted by a third party or there are third parties who are likely to be impacted by this shift in activity, then it's absolutely critical that you go beyond your normal day-to-day routine and think about that this compressed time frame, this pressure to deliver things exactly when needed, and then respond to the open rates. As you know, in the holidays, the open rates can spike, the click-through activity can spike, and timing is critical. And people are looking for information on what's working and what's not working. So there's a lot more preparation required, and so you can't really go too deep in understanding all the points that need to be visible to ensure that you can execute perfectly.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so now we've done everything we can, right, to avoid the oops. But now you've had that oh crap moment when you realize that there's something wrong with your email, and sometimes those errors are discovered by people very senior in your organization, and you inevitably get that you just messed up phone call that always stinks. So once you get that phone call, or once you discover that you've made the mistake, what do you do? So the first thing in all of this is to stay calm, right? And I know if you attended the last webinar, there was also advice I offered. Stay calm, take a deep breath, and truly understand what the error is, right? I mean, sometimes we get so caught up in our own email programs that we act as if the sky is falling because, the pixel spacing wasn't just perfect on the table. And the reality is that things like, there are just some things about our programs that people don't pay nearly as much attention to as we do. And so you need to really kind of take a deep breath, take a step back, and truly assess the situation, right? What is happening? How egregious is the error? So one of the questions that I think is always important to ask is it revenue impacting, right? You need to understand is this error in essence going to affect your bottom line? And there are, that can happen in different ways. And I mean, customer experience is extremely important. And, but also keeping an eye on your bottom line is critical in all of this as well. So, I'm not going to, some of you may be familiar with this story, but last holiday season, there was a big retailer that had sent out an email message that was promoting iPads on sale for like a dirt cheap price. And people and the error, the issue actually carried through into their e-com system where the price had been keyed in incorrectly, and so it was being served up on their website wrong. It was being referenced in their email incorrectly, and the price was so extremely low that they actually couldn't support it. That is a huge error, right? That is a huge error, and it's not. There comes a point in time where you have to not point fingers and be like, well, the e-com people gave me this pricing, and you just have to rally the troops and figure out what you have to do, right? So that was a huge error, but if you got a broken link in your navigation and people can't get directly to your Contact Us page, or your view in browser link isn't working, that's not so monumental, right? Not something to kind of freak out about. big discrepancy in pricing, that's a freak-out moment. Not so much if it's just a link. So I think the critical thing here is, and this is what a lot of people avoid, and Peter and I were talking about this a little bit too, and I know, Peter, from the client side, you can actually talk a little bit about what this escalation should look like. But, I think, one of the things that we have to do is make sure we identify the people inside the organization that we need to involve to address the mistake and make sure they're aware, right? So in the example of the big box retailer, right, they had to let customer service know. They had to, get their legal team involved. They had to talk to the e-commerce organization because ultimately they were making the determination that they were not going to honor the purchases that were made. And so there were a number of implications across the organization that they had to address. And had, one person in the organization decided they were just going to try to be a maverick and, kind of cover it up or, mitigate the exposure to it, it could have been very detrimental to their organization. So getting the proper people involved immediately can really help to, get the situation addressed, but also calm the situation because, cooler heads prevail. You get your kind of group think going on, and everybody starts thinking about, what they need to do to mitigate the oops, and, inevitably an email will be sent, but, everybody has their tasks that they need to address. Peter, did you have, I know that you've kind of been through this before, do you have some, as you look at how, errors were escalated up to you inside your organization, how important was it that you were able to get that information?
Very important. I think you have to have a culture of responsiveness, this is part of the program. This is kind of marketing today. What's so different about it? There isn't the same lead time, and customers react very quickly. They have social media at their fingertips. I think and you'll probably get into this, but leading into, the right reactions are one of agility, moving quickly, escalating, coordinating with all those that are involved in the process, including your ESP, by the way, who obviously needs to be alerted to the situation, be prepared for something that needs to be done, and you need their support on, and that's 7/24. So that means access to that ESP when you need them. But then the obvious things that follow are act with integrity, act with honesty, ask for forgiveness, and finally compensate for any inconvenience you may have caused your customers. So a sort of a rule of thumb in terms of how to think about each of those steps as you group and discuss what are we going to do about it.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and at the end, right, everybody that needs to know, you need to make sure they know, right? It's always worse if somebody who should have been involved finds out after the fact across the board. All right, so finally, now you've got the oops, you've got the right people involved. Now you need to determine if you actually want to send an oops message and who you want to send it to. So, just because maybe a message went out to your entire target audience, doesn't necessarily mean that every single one of them actually caught or experienced the error. And so, the question becomes, does everybody need to get it? Is this something I need to broadcast and make sure everyone is aware of? Or, is this something that I can address with a smaller subset of people that I can identify that experienced the error? So, clearly, again, response is going to be driven by, how egregious the mistake, but, it can be tailored to the situation. So, for example, if you did have a call to action link that wasn't working, or, maybe someone was clicking the link, but to Peter's point, you had such an increase in site traffic that maybe, the site was down or there was an issue and they weren't able to convert, that you can identify, who clicked the link, right? And then, maybe message to them specifically. If it's an error in the URL itself, right, you potentially have the opportunity, depending on the capability of your ESP, to actually correct the URL on the back end. So anybody who hadn't clicked on it yet wouldn't experience the error, right? So you can focus on a subset of people who, have it's reasonable to assume that they have. So it doesn't always have to be the entire group. And then, in the case of, like we were talking about the big box retailer, there was a lot of damage control that had to be done. It went beyond just sending an oops message. Peter, to your point, there was a whole lot of social, negative PR going on out there too. Lots of tweets, lots of Facebook posts, lots of unhappy people. And there sometimes you need to rally the troops and really extend the reach of that message. And in that case, it was definitely one of those needs. But in some situations, an oops message will suffice. So let's see. As we look at, and as I had said, the reality is that not every mistake is going to be yours. There are things that will require an oops message, especially around the holidays, that, we're going to have to deal with, and there are going to be mistakes that come from elsewhere in the organization. So maybe the promo code was wrong, or, the offer went to the wrong audience. Maybe spikes in traffic, like I said, caused accessibility issues to the site or to, the experience for the customer. Other common things, especially during the holiday season, inventory depletion. You've sent an offer for a specific product that the customer can no longer get. Sometimes those are very frustrating moments for consumers, and so you have to look at ways that you can address that. So not all of them are in your control, but regardless, the customer doesn't see a line of demarcation between the different departments within the brand. They see the brand, and so sometimes, an email message is going to have to go out to support an oops, and it's going to be a mistake that you didn't make, and so we're just going to have to support the organization that way. So we're going to look at a couple best practices around messaging against an oops, and then we're going to look at some examples of some oops messages and some things that other brands have experienced by way of mistake. So first, we're going to look at what are these best practices. Clearly there are some things you have to look at, right? You want to be timely. You have to be timely in the delivery of the oops message. It should happen, as close to the actual action as possible to avoid that customer dissatisfaction. It is something that, if you've decided to send the oops, it's big enough that it needs to have, some attention brought to it. So it needs to take priority and it needs to be addressed immediately. Not so immediately that you send another oops message. Clearly you're going to want to QA those very closely. But, you do want to, take the time to, get it right, but get it out quickly. You also want to make sure that you really do maintain your brand voice in the message. So I've seen some that, with some organizations that have, a really kind of fun and comical tone to their messages, but then they send out this message that's like, oh, sorry, we sent this by mistake. And it doesn't carry that same fun tone. And so you want to make sure that, the messages that you're sending are really in the context of your brand voice, and make sure you put that there. I mean, we have to remember that, ultimately we send email for a living as a group of people here, and your organization, delivers what it delivers, and we have to make sure that we maintain a sense of self in what it is that we're doing and what it is we're delivering, so that the customer's experience with the brand is consistent regardless of what it is we're saying. The oops definitely in a lot of situations deserves to be acknowledged, but the sense of intensity in the response really should correlate with the degree of the error. So the next two are really kind of symbiotic. You want to be transparent, and don't blame others. Nobody likes when they hear someone else being blamed. So just like in everyday life, we all understand that mistakes happen, and when we make a mistake, we own up to it. But, it's how you address them, it's how you respond to the mistakes that people remember. So, just be as forthcoming as reasonably possible, within, again, the sense and the tone of your voice, and, try not to really kind of play the blame game. And really, most importantly, you need to learn something from it. What was the mistake, and was it avoidable? And if it was, how do you adjust your pre-launch process to really make sure that it doesn't happen again? Right? I mean, the goal here is to learn from our mistakes, and then apply what we've learned so that we don't continue to make them. the same lecture I give my children. But, like I said, to close this out, I really wanted to share with you guys some oops messages that we've seen. And just, to remember that, we do all make mistakes and that you're in good company. These are some great brands that have had to bite the bullet and send the oops message. So we're going to look at a couple of these here. So this is New York Magazine or New York Media, and they were doing some testing overnight and sent some test messages out to their entire list. I would bet that it's possible that they didn't realize it until some people probably started calling their customer service organization. But in this one, it's interesting because they actually call out if you've unsubscribed by accident, right? So if you unsubscribed by this random message that we sent you, and you want to get back on our list, please do so. So it gives you the opportunity. They recognize that the message that was sent could have potentially driven attrition in their list, and wanted to really find an opportunity to get those folks back in their good graces. Subject line was sorry for yesterday's accidental test message. It stands out. People recognize that there was a mistake, and probably curious to open up the message and see what it was. So this is a good example of when good tests go bad. This one is fun. The Think Geek one. So they do a little bit of blaming in this one, but they're blaming the dogs. But this is a fun one. They actually do keep in the tone of their message. They recognize the mistake that was made. So it was points balances were incorrect in the messages that were going out, and they've decided that moving forward they were going to let the monkeys do the math. So this is a fun one. It calls out the oops in the subject line specifically, and recognizes that they could potentially be in the doghouse for not conveying account information correctly. So they owned up to it, and this one was fun. All right, here is one. So this was from PacSun. This one, again, this wasn't an issue with email. This was a site down. There was an issue with their site, and so the subject line very specifically calls that out. In the header of this message is where they actually call out the issue. So this is the sorry for the inconvenience. We're back up now and ready to deliver. But the rest of the message focuses on the offer that they've given because of the mistake. So it doesn't always have to result in a discount. As you can see in the other two examples, there was nothing offered, for the mistake. But sometimes it really does warrant the extra discount. So here they extended, their one-day only, offer through Sunday because of the issue. This one actually, is, I actually have some friends who have celiacs, and this could be detrimental to somebody who has a gluten allergy. But this is just the recognition that the recipe that they had given out was actually not gluten-free, and so they wanted to call that to the attention of anybody who had received their recipe of the week. In this example, they're offering up alternatives. So, it was, bulgur, which is not gluten-free, and they were offering up recommendations for things you could swap out in place of the bulgur. So, they called attention to the mistake, and then they provided some information on how to rectify it. So this one, this is actually the message that went out. So this was the message that contained the oops. And while this oops isn't adamantly apparent, the challenge with this one that went out from Which is that it went out to their entire subscriber base. But it was very specific to their Briar Creek location. And so they had some fun with this. They, included the, just oops was the subject line. And here they pointed out, the free geography lesson to find out where, Briar Creek is. So again, they didn't offer anything specific, but they did want to recognize the mistake and apologize. All right, I think this might be, we've got one or two more here, but this one is a shipping error, right? So there was a delay in shipping from and that can happen especially during the holiday season. So this was just a quick note from Kate Spade about, thanks for your patience, and here's 20% off, your entire next purchase through, January 31st. So again, recognizing the issue and providing some sense of, compensation for it. And then this is the last one. This one I just like because, the guy's asleep on the job, but I love the subject line, it's "we screwed up," right? And how many times I say it more frequently than I'd like, but, they screwed up. They forgot to update their sales prices on their website, and, they were calling attention to the fact that they did it. So they put the $10 teas back up for sale with the proper pricing for an undefined period of time. They just extended the sale. So these are some fun examples of, what some brands have experienced. And as you can see, everybody has challenges, right? And they run the gamut of, we've sent to the wrong list, to our site went down, to, hey, our shipping courier is having problems. But, ultimately it's a great way to communicate and kind of share the oops. Peter, have you seen any examples or some fun oops messages that you've come across or encountered in your tenure?
Not that I can illustrate, but I do think that these are great examples, and I think the key thing here is to be topical and relevant where possible to what's going on. So if you can tie into the weather or some other local situation that people are connecting with, I think that's a useful tool as well. But one thing I did want to add, Cara, as you're aware, the open rates tend to be relatively or higher than normal when oops messages are sent out if they're captured in the subject lines, which means people are interested in your business. They're interested in how you react. And that, obviously done well, reflects positively on the brand, reflects positively on retention and loyalty overall. If people are aware that you're listening and you're paying attention to what they are doing and how it affects them. So I think the big part of this is those subject lines are really, really important. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, compensate for your mistake where you can, and really satisfy the customer expectation.
Absolutely. And then I do recall a story that you shared about manufacturing an oops, and I don't have any of those in here, but is that a story you're willing to share?
Well, we've certainly used things to the advantage of delayed shipments due to snow back east, situations like that create demand, limited demand because of weather, that sort of thing. Timely product in relation to weather obviously is another thing too, is to be seasonally correct in certain regions. So geo-targeting with certain messaging that may have been inappropriate for one region versus another. Obviously with running product, what we sell and we're selling in California was different from what one may be doing on the East Coast. So being sensitive to seasonal shifts and then correcting based upon that messaging and being aware of people's plight and circumstance. So that was my point about being topical, and we've certainly done that without being exploitative. At least acknowledge that customers are in a different state of mind and frame of mind, and you may have sent an inappropriate message, which is not necessarily an oops. It's something beyond your control, but we've certainly done that kind of messaging.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
So next week we'll be giving all of our webinar attendees an email success toolkit. We'll be emailing it to you. It'll contain a example project brief, a QA checklist, as well as an OOPS checklist and best practices. So look for that in your inbox sometime mid next week. And if you'd like to see Cara and Peter, join us in San Diego on October 9th through the 11th for our 5th annual Lifecycle Messaging Conference. This is for all email marketers, regardless of the email platform that you use. We have great speakers. Mitch Joel will be speaking, Sims Jenkins, and Jay Baer will be there. And for being a part of our webinar today, you can save 25% off of registration by using the promo code OOPS25. Learn more about the conference at bluehornet.com/conference, and when you close out of this WebEx, you'll be sent to that page. So now for a quick Q&A. We have some questions that came in for Peter and Cara. The first question: if you make a mistake, an oops email, what can your ESP do to help?
Well, I think it's going to depend. Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think it really just kind of depends on the mistake, right? If if it is something that can be corrected on the back end. So, for example, an incorrect URL that can potentially be swapped out after the message has been sent. Something like that is absolutely something that they can help you with. And also looking at, helping them dissect the problem. So if they're not sure why it happened, if it was a sending issue, there's the ability to partner there. And then I would say also strategically, having a conversation with, the strategy organization to, potentially talk about positioning or context of the oops message, and look at different ways that you can, most effectively capitalize on the sending of the oops.
Great. Next question. If you send a weekly newsletter and there is a mistake that's not time critical, is it better to wait to have a correction of the next week's issue rather than send a separate email?
I'll lead on this one. I actually recommend that you address the mistake as soon as possible. And an interim communication in between that newsletter announcing that mistake. Of course, it could depend upon the nature of the mistake and how critical it is in terms of misinformation. But I don't think there's any harm in actually constructing a message immediately and recognizing the error. And then just advising your customers. We talked about in the context of just in terms of the context of the brand and your insight into what may be useful to the customers. So I would recommend sending an interim communication around the issue.
Is there ever a time to send an oops email on purpose?
I giggle because Peter and I talked about this a little bit. I can give you the perspective that I have, and then Peter can share with you his, maybe from the client side of the house, where he used to live. So I would say that this is what we were talking about a little bit about the manufacturing of an oops. I don't think that you don't put oops in the subject line and then send a promotional offer. Right. If there is a contextual opportunity around, there was a mistake, or, so what Peter was saying before that, maybe you sent a message that didn't have, that somebody in, Southern Florida was, it was bathing suits, and you sent them to Southern Florida and Chicago in the dead of winter. Clearly the Chicago folks don't really care so much about bathing suits and when it's 10 below and snow on the ground. So those are opportunities where you can kind of manufacture the oops. But I don't know that I would necessarily make it a habit. Right? People will eventually tire of them and catch on to the fact that you're just sending oops messages to send them. So I would reserve them for the critical moments so that you don't become the boy who cried wolf. But I can certainly see opportunistically the periodic manufacturing of an oops.
Well said, and I agree with that. And I think if there are oops messages that you are manufacturing, they may be more inward-looking in terms of your own internal limitations or something you didn't deliver on. So this is adding a little bit of humor and having a bit of insight into your own internal areas. We've seen that sort of thing before. The guy in accounting made this mistake. This is that sort of oops versus saying it was an oops with my email. But certainly there's room to sort of create some sort of interest in messaging to get some added response to your emails.
Great. Next question. When a mistake goes viral on social media, should you respond?
I think you should always respond to social. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, and I think you should make the assumption that these are linked together, these communications, and therefore you need your social media team to be responding and translating that message because it will be out there, and then again doing the appropriate review of what that message looks like so it's consistent, because you can assume there will be some consistency now between what you communicate via email and what you put out on either Facebook, Twitter, or however you post any communication about that particular situation.
And as Jay Bear said, your social and your email people should be the same people. And last question. In print media, they used to print corrections without acknowledging what the mistake was. So instead of saying we incorrectly said 25%, when the correct amount was 30%, they just say the amount has been corrected to 30%. Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
I think it's a completely acceptable approach. I mean, you don't always have to say exactly what the error was. You can, just call out the correction and address it that way. Again, it's going to be situational, right? It is absolutely going to be situational. So if you look back at the Kate Spade example we had, where they had shipping issues, right? Well, we know you're delayed, right? We know you're not getting your stuff, so here's a discount. In the example of the Threadless example, where they said the sales prices weren't adjusted, they didn't say what it was. They just said that now they're only $10. So I think that's a very similar example to, they didn't call out the specific change, right? It wasn't that you went to the website and they were $25 and they were really only supposed to be $10. They just said they've been corrected to $10. So I think that's a very similar type of example, and I think it's a completely valid approach.
Yeah, I think there's something to think about here too, though, that a lot of this calculation, this difference in this example between 25 and 30% gets calculated in the shopping cart on a website. So I think the sort of being very direct about the difference is actually appropriate to spell out the difference, because customers may not have noticed it. It would be an opportunity for them to check themselves if they've been incorrectly charged, right? Versus having to sort of discreetly assume that something was corrected.
Right, and that's the type of message that you could actually send to, a subset of people who would have experienced that or been impacted by that exact change, right? Anybody who maybe put something in the cart and either did or didn't convert, because, Peter, to your point, that calculation is happening at the, at the cart process, and so you can probably identify the people who would have experienced that versus sending that very specific message to a very broad audience.
Yes.
All right. Well, that was our final question. I want to thank Peter and Kara so much for your expertise. I took copious notes myself. We will be sending a recording of the webinar as well as the deck to everybody on the phone, and we'll be sending the Holiday Success Toolkit too. So on behalf of the Blue Hornet team, thank you so much for your time today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.